Hey, this is the next episode. I got a comment last time, I think from Conrad, saying I should have expounded a bit more about narrative analysis. Not really sure how to do that, I guess. Because I guess the problem is I've done this for so long that it kind of works out like a 2 plus 2 in my brain. Or basically like basic arithmetic. You don't really think about the logical steps. You just add one and one together and then get two, something like that. So if you have like a very specific question, I guess you could ask me. As for today's topic, I want to talk about how to create the upset. This is a very important topic if you want to understand how understand both game theory and how like the narrative of how you want to like sell an upset story works. So got a few examples today. The one I want to talk about first is the one of the first esports games I ever watched. I think likely the first esports game I ever watched. It was a Brood War game. It was like years after it happened, but it was Jelizerg versus Best in the OSL finals, and Jelizerg at the time was way out of his prime, and Best had been like the new rising star, as it turned out. But as it turned out, like Jelizerg got the best bracket possible in order to get to the finals, which is a bunch of ZVPs, which was by far his best matchup, and then Best made it to the finals. But strangely, I don't think Best's best matchup was PVZ, or was even that good, even relative to like his other matchups. Even though he beat Jadong in a pro league, like his basically when I look back on it, like the record doesn't seem to point to Best being that great at PVZ at the time. But it's still a very important finals, especially in this aspect of that Best was this young up and rising star. He was the what you would expect from a Korean Kespa, like the machine that like takes these young like potential stars and like grinds them through until they eventually come out the other side as really strong players. And he was one of the latest in that project, in that like kind of process. Whereas Jelizerg was this old school player who had different different peaks at different eras. Like his first OSL was in 2004, and then his second was in 2005, and then by the time he gets to this third OSL finals, or I guess it would be his fourth OSL finals. It would be 2008. Wait, no, I think it's his fifth OSL finals. His fifth OSL finals is 2008. So he gets here, and this is a critical moment because this was during the Bisu, Stork, Jadong, Flash era, and this was a critical moment for Stork, surprisingly, because basically what happens is Jelizerg is out of his prime. Everybody knows this. He had been booted from, not booted, but he had been traded from SKT to a different team because they brought Jelizerg in to like improve their pro league, and then he is kind of a disaster. So they moved him back, and then ironically or not, or by fate, he ends up playing their SKT player in the finals and beating him 3-0. And what made this finals stand out to me so much when I first watched it was Jelizerg wasn't playing Brood War. Like, what I mean by that is he wasn't really playing the game. Like, he wasn't playing PVZ. He was actually playing the player, where he did these like super aggressive early game attacks that weren't necessarily the best strategies, but they were made specifically to cause like psychological warfare. He even admitted this in his like post game interview, where he believed that in the finals the skill difference between two players wasn't necessarily that big. So what would make the edge in those specific cases is the mental warfare, or like mental control. And what he did famously, I think it was in the second game, he did what I call the drone drill that like pierced the heavens, where basically it's like the perfect Jelizerg moment, because it's like a map and his overlord just barely gets into Bisu's base to see the gets into Best's base to see the mineral line, and then he gets all of his drones and clicks through to have all his drones mine for that mineral line. And what that does is it forms them all into the line the way the UI works, so they all stack on top of each other. And then when you stop, like, it fucks up all the UI and then breaks open the path, because that particular map you couldn't wall in like normal, so you had to like put a zealot between like two neutral assimilators. So he did that, and then he broke through and then won the game. And famously, that was that was the one. That's the OSL finals that created the Bisu face, because he was just fucking shocked, that Jelizerg would do this. And then Stork was shocked that Jelizerg could win, and then he kind of realized after the fact that that was the difference. That was like the difference between Jelizerg and Stork, where Stork was by far the better player, but Jelizerg is the one who won the OSL first before Stork for that era, and then it like went into Stork's mind is like, this is a winner's mentality. This is how you win. This it isn't about the game so much as it is about the player at that high of a level. And the reason I'm bringing this up about creating the upset is because even though this wasn't Best's best matchup by a long shot, I'm not even sure it was that great, considering I think his PVT is by far superior. It was still an upset, and and the way Jelizerg did it was he wasn't necessarily like the way Jelizerg created this upset was he wasn't necessarily like targeting strategy as much as he was targeting his inexperience, and that's a very like that's one of the ways to create an upset. And the reason you would target inexperience is because what happens is if you set a player who has like choking problems or pressure problems or tilting problems, if you can like control that, basically what happens is that shows up in their game, and then their game's like form goes dramatically downwards. And game form is generally the best, like on day game form is generally the best indicator of who will win. And in that case, because Jelizerg like forced Best's like in game form that day to decline because of like the psychological attack, he like created a much better playing field for himself to take that series. So the second one I want to talk about is one of the early CS:GO games I watched, or not necessarily watched, but one of the ones that not necessarily that early, because I watched it around like the end of 2014. But this one came around during a time where I was like kind of shocked, because all right, to explain this, I think it was during the envious like miniature like reign, I guess, where they were the best team in the world, and they had just won the major, and they were using this force buy style, and I didn't really understand Counter-Strike at the time because I hadn't really studied the game much. But I remember very specifically they were playing this team NRG in Counter Pit, and at the time I thought, okay, this isn't necessarily a game I need to watch. I just happened to be up. I just happened to be up at the time. It's like, okay, I'll watch this, because I didn't really think of much of NRG at the time, because God B, Legia, Silent, Justin, and then they had a stand-in, Tabson. And so even like the stand-in issue, like it's kind of a double-edged sword in that it could completely fuck up your team's chemistry, but if it doesn't, and if it works out, then the other teams don't really know how that one extra player like changes the entire game for all the different maps. So in that sense, it's a double-edged sword. But even then, if you consider it, like, all right, so if you consider the difference, basically NVS was like a championship winning team, NRG was like a tier 3, tier 2-ish team, but they had a stand-in, and this was very early on in both Justin and Silent's career. So they weren't that there was like no proof they could do anything at LAN, and famously like, okay, so this goes into a different philosophy about how you would like model players, but if you use the like Dota 2 1 through 5 positions, and you use that, sometimes you can use that you can also use like a rating system, kind of, where like basically like position 6 in Dota 2 is basically a guy who like completely sacrifices all of his resources, and he'll have terrible fucking stats, but he will have supported the other guys' games and have some impact that way. The problem with that energy lineup and like all subsequent God B Legia lineups is they basically have 2 position 6 players, so that's why they will never get far, or I don't think they'll ever get into a tier 1 team, because you can't have 3 guys that are so good that can carry 2 position 6 type players. But and the reason I'm bringing this up is because if you consider that, then basically what would happen is you need Silent, basically, if I was trying to theory craft a way for Energy to be envious, you would need Silent, Justin, and Tabson to have really fucking great games, which is what they ended up doing at that tournament. And then critical, but even then, like that shouldn't have been enough to be envious, because envious, like man for man, except for Devil, was a really like stacked lineup in terms of talent, in terms of experience, in terms of caliber. But they ended up losing that, and it wasn't. So I said earlier, it was the on form predictor is generally the best way to predict an upset, but even then that shouldn't have been enough. Given what was given like the way the teams like collided, but what like clinched it for NRG was that Envious threw a bunch of rounds for spying, so they never got the economy rolling. Because they can never get the economy rolling, they can never get the weaponry to deal with energy, because they just kept force buying. So like the combination of those two things created this upset. And let's see. Right. So the next example I'll bring up is the MVP squad from Dota 2 from last year. So this is a very funny team, right? Famously known as the caveman Dota style. Basically, if you had to describe this team, what happened is they looked at QO. They thought, okay, QO is the best player in Korea. What makes him such a great player? And if you look at everything about like QO's like attributes, the best thing about him is he never hesitates. He has great team fighting. He is super aggressive. So the entire other four players played that kind of style for QO, where they were always aggressive. They never hesitated, and it took every fight possible. So basically, they understood that this was like their style, that this was their team color, that this is who they were as a team, and because of that, they were able to create a bunch of upsets last year, because their style was so like high octane, high pressure, that the slower styles of like China and Europe, like a lot of them could just get caught off guard if they didn't see it coming, because what happened is they would take a team fight, and in general Dota 2 theory, what happens is when you win the team fight, you got the objective, which is a tower sometimes, or it could be like getting wards, or famously it'd be going for the Roshan. What MVP would do is they'd win the team fight, they take the tower, because it happened, maybe the tower is like right next to it, but if it's not right next to it, they'll take another team fight, and they'll just keep fighting over and over and over again. And so basically what happened was they were dragging the entire game into their very specific specialty, and that's where they created like a strategical upset, like similar to Energy versus Envious, but the difference between the MVP example and the Energy versus Envious example is the Energy versus Envious example is basically just something that Energy wasn't necessarily the initiator of. They just benefited from the fact that Envious like loved to force buy and then ruined their own economy that way. Rather than the MVP example, they were the initiators. They understood what made them great, or made them great as a team. So they constantly forced this kind of style upon the opponent, and that the way they played it, it really felt like people got drawn into it too much. What I mean by that is like sometimes, all right, think about it this way. Sometimes when you get into an argument, at some point in the argument, you might stop thinking about like why you were fighting so much as you are fighting, and because you are fighting, you just continue fighting. That's kind of how like MVP was, where like people basically it felt like teams, like when they started fighting MVP, they just got sucked into like this vortex of action, and like there was like no time to stop and think about what is actually the best plan to stop MVP. It's more like we have to keep fighting because they're fighting, we have to keep fighting because they're fighting. So that's kind of how MVP like created this upset by just using like this very strategical style. It's not even that strategical. It's actually this very specific style. But what would happen is they would force they would force the other players they would force their style upon the game, and then that style like emphasize their strengths, which is why they could beat a lot of teams, even though a lot of teams that were on paper better than them. But because they forced them, basically they forced the other team to a battleground where MVP had the edge. Where even though on paper like the team is better could be better in every other category, but in that one specific instance MVP was better, and that's how they would win their series or games. So I've talked about the mental edge with Jelizer. Talked about like kind of like an on form, and come to like this like a strategic identity. Another way to think about it is okay. There's this article. I think I'll link it in the YouTube. I forget who it's by, but it's a Magic the Gathering article. It's called "Who is the Beatdown?" and it's a very good article about understanding what is your relative strength to your opponent, and understanding who is the attacker, who is the defender in any particular match or game. And so even though it's about Magic the Gathering, it applies to basically any like competitive like game, any competitive game. So the reason I bring that up is because I think the master of that kind of thinking was MVP from StarCraft 2. Now, MVP from StarCraft 2 is a player I consider transcendent from his game, meaning like if MVP disappeared from history tomorrow, there would be no MVP. There could be players that might have more achievements than MVP. There could be players that there could be plenty of players that like filled the gaps and like won all those like titles that MVP didn't win, but none of them could create like the legacy MVP had. That's because all right, think about it this way. 2011 MVP was super dominant, and while that's like very impressive, there are players from other games or even within the same game that had like a very similar era. What made MVP special was what I call his miracle year, which is 2012. Because at that point, I don't think he was a very good player in like I don't think he was a very good player in like a mechanical sense. Like he was like because of all the injuries he had, it made it very hard to practice, and that was very detrimental, especially in like the Korean esports scene where everybody practices, and it's even worse because it's like a 1v1 game. So there was technically like almost no limit to how much good practice you could get. So what would happen is MVP was forced to create like a bunch of strategies that assumed his on form game day would always be worse than all of his opponents, because he himself knew that because of his injuries he could never have like a good day. Like it was impossible. Like when other players go into a series, they could expect in the best of 3 series, they could expect something like, okay, on the first game, I might have been at like a 6 out of 10 level because I was just warming up. On the second game, I was really there. I was like 10 out of 10. But the third game was like 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10. Pretty good, but not like spectacular. In MVP's case, if he went into a best of 3 series, he'd have to assume, okay, my best day might be 5 out of 10. Or maybe it might be 7 out of 10. My average day might be 5 out of 10. My worst might be 1 out of 10 because of all like because he basically couldn't feel his keyboard or his mouse. So if on form on form is like the best predictor of how to create the upset, in MVP's case he'd have to go to other ways. So what he did was he'd use strategy and psychological warfare to create his victories. So basically what would happen is in order to strategically like beat people, oftentimes he'd have to either like improvise or he'd create a strategy before the game that like completely shocked the other opponent. So for instance, when he was playing Naniwa, that's in GSL Season 2 2012 in the playoffs, he was playing Naniwa, and if you went before this match, Naniwa was playing arguably the best StarCraft of his life up to that point. And he was certainly getting the best practice of his life up to that point. And and going into the match, I actually had Naniwa favored, not by much, because I actually felt like MVP's like strength was always in preparation a bit, but Naniwa's like PVT was really excellent at the time, and he was in great form. So before the match I'd had to say 55-45 about, but MVP ended up winning the series in pretty decisive fashion, and the reason is because he was able to like I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure he either predicted or he figured out Naniwa's like play style, and that's why he used like a very old archaic like bio tank style against Naniwa, because Naniwa famously liked to put all of his like units into a ball, which it condense everything to make it easier to control, but at the same time like the with bio tank you could get a huge like flank. You could get a huge flank and do a lot of AOE damage. And then famously, he did the bunch of 11-11s, which kind of tilted Naniwa off the face of the planet. So you go into the second series of the semifinals of that GSL, and he plays Parting. Now Parting was playing. All right, if Naniwa was playing like the best of his career up to that point, I'd say Parting was playing the best PVT in the entire world. And unlike Naniwa, like Parting's like PVT was a lot more varied. It was a lot more aggressive, but he also played like the macro style. So famously, like Parting said, "Okay, I saw those games. You can't pull the same shit off on me. I'll see it. I'll see it coming." So, but he had just enough respect. Like it should be a 3-0, but you know what? Maybe a 3-1 because he is MVP. And then what would happen is MVP would win 3-1, and what. Like the critical moment actually comes, I think, I forget the order of the games, but it was in Toon Valley, and they were basically exchanging a few early game blows, and then MVP had killed a few units, and then MVP like noticed, like MVP does this like genius move that nobody had ever thought of up to that point. It was like a mid game, it was like 2 base versus 2 base, and Parting's like army wasn't really up. But if it was army versus army, Parting's army would win anyway. So MVP pulled all of his SCVs and then did like the first like TVP SCV like mid game like SCV pool of the time, and like it completely shocked Parting because in the game he didn't have anywhere close to the same units, so MVP rolled and won that game. But if you think about it on a strategical level, Parting loses this game that he thought he was going to win. But if you think about it in the grand context of what he was going to do, Parting's like entire like build and strategy was based off of a world where this SCV pool didn't exist, because SCV pools prior to that in the game were all used in the early game with 11-11, which Parting could have easily like held. Now he was moving into a world where MVP could pull it in the mid game, but he didn't have the information, he didn't have the experience to know how many units did he have to build in order to stop this. But if he built too many, obviously MVP famously would take advantage of that and like go for the later game and have a larger army then, and then win the attrition battle there, and then kind of like fucked with Parting's brain, and then MVP's like surprise, and he did a 1-1-1 the next game, and like that completely like broke Parting's brain, and then he ended up losing that series. So basically, MVP was using improvisation, psychological warfare, and like creating new strategies in order to win these games. Like I think one of the like strangest and famous examples was his series against Rain in season 4 in the semifinals, because I think Rain was easily the best. For my money, I think Rain was easily the best Protoss player of that time, and crucially, I think he was like miles above MVP in terms of like standard strategy and mechanics. But there was only like one little like problem with Rain, was it felt like his ideology was that if he truly believed he could beat anybody in the late game, like no matter how like far behind he was in the early and mid game. So famously, like MVP abused him of this by like all-inning two or three times in the best of 5 series. And then what happened with the all-in is like Rain would be like, oh shit, he all-in me. You know what? I'll cut even less corners next time. I'll cut even less corners next time. And then he kept thinking in his brain, I just have to defend. I just have to defend this all in, and I'll win. But what happened is MVP knew he was thinking that, so MVP cut all the corners, and then like got a huge economy, and then would win later. But in Rain's mind, what he was thinking was, it doesn't matter if MVP does this, like, because I will still be MVP. I will still be MVP in the late game. But MVP, what happened was he combined like the strategy he had with parting with the SCV pools, and then he combined the fact like Rain's psychological profile to create like to create this like game plan where like he kind of forced like Rain to be even more safe than he was previously with the all-ins and early on in the series, and then he would get this super greedy style combined with like this SCV pool, and then basically just run over Rain, because what happens is if you do that, like the difference between like army size is army size and the composition is such that it doesn't really matter that MVP is worse mechanically, because not even Rain will be able to like fight out of it. So by the time Rain might have realized what was happening, he was already dead. So that's kind of how like that's kind of why I've always considered like MVP one of the smartest. Actually, no, I consider him probably the smartest StarCraft 2 player, because he would think in way. Because, all right, it's kind of a fucked up thing to say, but MVP's like legacy would probably be worse if he didn't get those injuries. Because if he didn't get those injuries, I don't think you ever see this like side of him. Not until maybe years later, where he's literally like thinking miles ahead of everybody else, and like the way he would prepare series, the way he would like use strategic like psychological profiles, the way like he saw the game was, I still think it's unmatched to this day. Like, and that's kind of why I consider him a transcendent sort of player, because I don't like the extreme like achievements he won with like the extreme like and the extreme ways he had to go about getting them, because none of them were based off of like his in-game form, were like so extreme that I've never really seen anything like it. Like the closest I've seen was like I've heard of Rafa and Quake. I like the way I've seen a few of his games that's kind of similar-ish, and I guess High in League of Legends, but that difference is like High was only winning at NASLES and had some success internationally, whereas MVP was the best in the world at points, or certainly the best Terran in the world for 2012. So it's kind of, he's always such a strange, like he's such a strange conundrum, MVP, because I can't even think of somebody else doing that in StarCraft 2. I mean, it's a bit different in a few other games because of how like the games work, but yeah, that's kind of how like MVP would create these upsets. So basically, what I'm saying is, if you want to create a story about like a potential upset, you have to think about it in that kind of form. So in those kind of like criteria, where you have to think about like the mental edge. You have to think about in-game form on that day. I think that's actually the most important. And I think this is an aside, but if you're doing it for CS:GO or something, I think the best like predictor for in-game form is generally the map. So I think it was yesterday where, for whatever reason, it's like typical exist map pick. He let iGame get to train, and then they got upset because iGame's best map is train. I'm not exactly so, and because iGame's best map is train, therefore all their players in form is better than you is gets like the highest like percentage chance of showing up because it's their best map. So I don't really know what they were thinking. So yeah, in-game form, psychological edge, and then like the strategic identity. Like these are all things you have to think about if you're trying to craft a upset narrative. And the reason okay, so I guess I'll end it with this. If you want to, game theory wise, if you are the underdog and you want to create this upset, where you are against a player that's far superior than you. You need to understand where your strengths are and where your opponent's weaknesses are, and then you need to drag your opponent into a battleground where their strengths are minimized and your strengths are emphasized, and their weaknesses are emphasized, and your weaknesses don't matter. That's the end.